For decades, the public image of the Second World War has been preserved in carefully managed archives, polished speeches, and commemorative textbooks. We are told of sacrifice, liberation, and unity against tyranny. Yet buried beneath those familiar stories lies another narrative: sealed files, vanished testimonies, and erased evidence that governments on all sides conspired to suppress. These were not mere footnotes. They were disturbing truths that threatened to fracture alliances, expose betrayals, and shatter the carefully constructed myths of post-war order. The documents that remain are incomplete. Heavily redacted reports stamped "most secret", fragments of intercepted messages, missing trial records, and survivor testimonies smuggled out under risk of death. They tell of massacres buried by propaganda, of backroom deals where nations were traded like playing cards, of convoys deliberately erased from official logs, and of scientists responsible for mass death smuggled to safety by the very governments that once vowed justice. These stories are not comfortable. They are the shadows that never made it into the history books, the erased files that whisper of moral compromises too dark to acknowledge. Tonight, we reopen those sealed folders and bring into the light 4 shocking World War II stories that were erased forever. Chapter 1: The Forbidden Massacre at Nemmersdorf. On the cold morning of October 21, 1944, in a quiet East Prussian village near the Angarap River, the war revealed its ugliest face. The place was Nemmersdorf, a farming community of wooden barns and cobblestone streets, where time had once seemed immune to the chaos consuming Europe. That illusion ended when the spearhead of the Soviet 11th Guards Army, supported by armored units, crossed into German territory. Nemmersdorf became the first German settlement to fall under Red Army control, and what happened within those next 24 hours was so grotesque, so politically explosive, that it was buried beneath layers of censorship by both sides of the conflict. The massacre was not only a crime of war, but a crime of memory, erased almost as quickly as it had unfolded. Survivors later described the sounds of tank treads grinding across the frozen ground, and the sudden crack of rifle fire as villagers rushed to hide. Some civilians, elderly men and women, were ordered into barns and schoolhouses under the pretense of questioning. Witnesses reported that Soviet soldiers, emboldened by their breakthrough, turned to terror as a weapon. What followed was mass violence. Civilians shot point blank, women of all ages subjected to rape, and children murdered in front of their parents. The local churchyard became a scene of horror. Corpses were left in humiliating positions, bound to carts or nailed against doors, as if designed to shock any who might later stumble upon the village. Testimonies from Wehrmacht medics who arrived 2 days later describe scenes so horrifying that even hardened soldiers struggled to write their reports. One noted simply, "What we found was beyond human recognition." The massacre at Nemmersdorf quickly reached German propaganda offices. Joseph Goebbels seized upon the incident, ordering photographs to be distributed worldwide, portraying Soviet soldiers as barbarians. But here lies the paradox. While Nazi officials used the massacre to harden German resolve, Soviet authorities acted swiftly to destroy or discredit all evidence. NKVD political officers classified the reports as Operation Silence. Surviving civilians who had fled into nearby towns were rounded up, interrogated, and some disappeared entirely. Captured Soviet documents years later suggested explicit orders: eliminate witnesses who might contradict Moscow's narrative of liberation. The Soviets could not allow proof of their brutality to undermine their image as liberators of Europe. What is often forgotten is that Western allies too played a role in suppressing this story. After 1945, when fragile alliances were crucial in forming the United Nations and securing Europe's reconstruction, the massacre of Nemmersdorf became an inconvenient truth. British and American intelligence were aware of the incident through intercepted German and Soviet communications. Yet in both London and Washington, reports were shelved. Declassified Foreign Office files from the 1950s reveal a chilling note: no advantage to be gained in pursuing Soviet culpability. Risks outweigh evidential clarity. In other words, the truth was deliberately buried to protect diplomatic relations. For decades, historians dismissed Nemmersdorf as exaggerated Nazi propaganda. Indeed, Goebbels' cynical exploitation of the photographs made later scholars wary of believing German accounts. But in the 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, fragments of Soviet military logs surfaced. Among them were chilling orders marked with the code name Directive 06. They confirmed that the 2nd Guards Tank Corps had crossed into East Prussia and that operational necessity required total control of the area, language often used to justify elimination of civilians. Even more disturbing were testimonies smuggled out by German civilians deported to Siberia, who confirmed that Red Army commanders had sanctioned violence as both retribution and psychological warfare. The erasure of Nemmersdorf is not simply about what happened in one village. It is about the deliberate destruction of evidence, the manipulation of history, and the silencing of survivors. To this day, there are no official memorials recognized by international institutions, no trials that prosecuted the officers responsible. The incident exists in a gray zone of history, acknowledged by some, denied by others, distorted by propaganda on both sides. The truth remains fragmented, hidden between redacted files and half-forgotten testimonies. Imagine walking through that village in October 1944. The fields are silent, the air smells of smoke, and the ground is littered with broken icons from the local church. A child's doll lies beside a cart splattered with blood. The silence is oppressive, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery. It is a scene meant to instill terror, to crush the spirit of a population already weary of war. Yet the real terror came after, when the memory itself was strangled, erased from the narrative of liberation that the Allies so desperately needed to uphold. By the late 20th century, the name Nemmersdorf barely appeared in academic texts outside of fringe references. Survivors aged, their testimonies ignored or dismissed. But in the small community of post-war émigrés, whispers remained. They told of neighbors hanged from rafters, of elderly women violated and murdered, of children used as human shields. The truth was too disturbing for polite history, too politically dangerous for governments invested in the myth of a clean victory. The massacre lingered like a ghost in the margins of archives, forever branded as a forbidden memory. The Forbidden Massacre at Nemmersdorf stands as a stark reminder. Wars are not only fought on battlefields, but in memory itself. What is allowed to be remembered, and what is erased, can shape entire generations' understanding of justice, morality, and truth. In October 1944, a small village in East Prussia was destroyed. In the years that followed, the evidence of its destruction was buried deeper than the bodies themselves. And yet, through fragments of testimony, faded photographs, and the reluctant declassification of files, the horror still whispers from the shadows, reminding us that silence, too, can be a weapon of war. Chapter 2. Churchill's Secret Deal for Poland. In October of 1944, as the Allied armies pressed toward Germany from the west and the Soviet juggernaut advanced from the east, a quiet meeting in Moscow sealed the fate of millions. Official histories describe it blandly as a wartime conference, but among the declassified fragments in the British Foreign Office lies a piece of paper that tells a much darker story. This slip, scribbled in Winston Churchill's own hand, carried percentages that divided Eastern Europe like spoils of war. Romania, 90% Soviet influence; Greece, 90% British; Hungary and Yugoslavia, 50-50; and Poland, the country whose invasion had ignited the war, was effectively surrendered to Soviet control. Stalin marked his blue tick upon the paper, and in that moment, the fate of an entire nation was decided, without consultation, without defense, without mercy. It was called the Percentages Agreement. For decades, governments sanitized the truth, framing it as a minor footnote. But for Poland, it was a betrayal that still scars national memory. Churchill entered Moscow desperate. The Red Army had liberated much of Eastern Europe, but liberation came shackled to Soviet authority. In Poland, the Warsaw Uprising had just been crushed in blood and fire, with tens of thousands executed as the Wehrmacht obliterated the capital. The Polish Home Army had expected Soviet assistance, but the Red Army halted at the Vistula River, refusing to intervene. In London, the exiled Polish government pleaded for help, but Churchill, aware of his army's exhaustion and of Roosevelt's insistence on preserving alliance unity, sought compromise instead of confrontation. In Kremlin, chambers thick with cigar smoke, maps were unfolded and entire nations became bargaining chips. The Polish question was toxic. Britain had entered the war in September 1939 to defend Polish sovereignty after Hitler's invasion. Thousands of Polish soldiers had fought alongside the British, from the skies over the Battle of Britain to the fields of Monte Cassino. Yet in secret, their homeland was already being bartered away. Cabinet notes marked "most confidential" reveal Churchill's calculation. Without Stalin's cooperation, the war might drag on, and Germany's final defeat could stall. The Americans, focused on the Pacific, were unwilling to challenge the Soviet Union directly. In this climate of expediency, principles fell silent. The paper with percentages became the unspoken contract that Poland's independence would be sacrificed for geopolitical stability. The duplicity deepened. In public, Churchill still delivered speeches praising Polish bravery and promising a free future. But in private telegrams to Roosevelt, he spoke of pragmatic accommodations. One memorandum dated October 1944, declassified only in the late 1990s, states bluntly, "We must reconcile ourselves to the Soviet predominance in Poland, however distasteful." The language is cold, bureaucratic, and devastating. It reduced the blood of countless Polish soldiers to mere ink on paper. It reduced a nation's sovereignty to a calculation of percentages. Polish leaders in exile never learned of this secret understanding during the war. They were instead encouraged to continue their struggle, unaware that the ground beneath them had already been sold. The truth began to leak only after the Yalta Conference in February 1945, when Stalin forced recognition of his puppet government in Warsaw. By then, Polish troops who had bled for Allied victory were returning home to Soviet occupation. Many who protested were arrested, deported, or executed. The British government discouraged public outrage, framing Soviet dominance as a temporary necessity. Internal records reveal Foreign Office officials instructing diplomats to avoid inflammatory language when discussing Poland's fate. It was a policy of silence, calculated to bury the betrayal. What makes this story more disturbing is the deliberate erasure of the agreement from public knowledge. The infamous slip of paper with the percentages was never officially entered into government archives. Churchill himself later referred to it as a naughty document, claiming it had been destroyed. Yet it survived, hidden among private papers, surfacing only decades later. Its survival is almost accidental, a relic that should have been burned like so many other inconvenient truths. Without it, the betrayal might have been denied entirely. Even with it, apologists downplayed its significance, insisting it was a mere informal note. But for those who lived under Soviet tanks in Warsaw, Lublin, and Krakow, there was nothing informal about the loss of freedom. The consequences of Churchill's deal stretched far beyond 1945. Poland endured 4 decades of communist rule, its people silenced, its economy drained, its leaders subjugated to Moscow. Every uprising, from Poznan in 1956 to the Solidarity movement in the 1980s, carried the weight of that original betrayal. And while Churchill is remembered as the steadfast defender of liberty, the secret pages of October 1944 reveal a man willing to trade liberty for expedience, for percentages, for survival of empire. It was realpolitik at its coldest, and its victims were those least able to defend themselves. The betrayal was not only political, it was personal. Polish pilots who had defended Britain during the Blitz returned home after the war, only to be branded enemies of the state by communist authorities. Many were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. Families were torn apart, exiles scattered across the world. These men had fought for a promise that was never kept. They had risked everything for Britain, only to discover that Britain had already written their homeland's death sentence in Moscow. In later years, Churchill defended his actions as necessary. He claimed that without agreement with Stalin, the war might have dragged on, costing countless lives. Historians sympathetic to him argue that he had no choice, that Poland was doomed the moment the Red Army entered its borders. Yet such arguments cannot erase the betrayal. The truth remains that Poland was not lost to inevitability, but to a conscious decision made in secrecy and buried for decades. The sanitized histories of the war rarely dwell on this moment, preferring narratives of Allied unity and triumph. But in the shadows of declassified files, the betrayal of Poland emerges as one of the most haunting examples of erased history. Picture the scene in that Kremlin chamber. Dim light glinting off maps, pens scratching hurriedly across paper, 2 men laughing quietly over the fate of millions. Stalin's blue pencil marks approval. Churchill's cigar smoke drifts upward. Outside, soldiers are dying in ruined cities, believing they fight for freedom. They do not know their freedom has already been sold. The room is quiet, the decision sealed, the paper folded away. A single tick of a pencil erases a nation's future. And in the silence that follows, history itself is rewritten, not in truth, but in percentages. Chapter 3: The Vanished Convoy of Murmansk. The Arctic convoys were among the most dangerous supply operations of the Second World War. Between 1941 and 1945, Allied merchant ships braved sub-zero temperatures, polar storms, and relentless attacks from German U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers to deliver vital supplies to the Soviet Union. More than 4 million tons of cargo were transported through those icy waters, everything from tanks and aircraft to food and raw materials. The convoys were lifelines, and their success was celebrated. Yet buried in Admiralty records, half erased, from official logs lies the mystery of one convoy that never arrived. Known by the designation DN-12, it sailed in late 1943 from the port of Loch Ewe in Scotland, bound for Murmansk. What happened afterward remains a suppressed chapter, absent from most histories, erased deliberately from naval records, and obscured by conflicting testimonies. Its disappearance is more than a maritime tragedy. It is a story of betrayal, espionage, and deliberate silence. The known facts are few, but chilling. DN-12 reportedly carried not only standard supplies, but experimental radar equipment and sealed chemical stockpiles, the kind of cargo deemed too valuable to risk in unescorted transports. Naval intelligence files suggest the convoy was shadowed by German aircraft off the coast of Norway, but no official record exists of an attack. Instead, the convoy appears to vanish mid-transit, erased as though it had never sailed. Families of the merchant sailors received no official explanation, only vague references to "lost at sea." Admiralty archives later revealed a note stamped "withdrawn by order of SOE 1946." No reason was provided, no explanation offered. A mission critical to Soviet survival had been scrubbed from memory. Why? The fragments of evidence point to something darker than enemy action. Declassified Soviet naval documents uncovered in the early 1990s reference the arrival of foreign cargo diverted for state use during the same period. The implication is stark. Allied supplies intended for Murmansk were seized directly by Soviet authorities under secret agreement, while their disappearance was concealed by British intelligence. Survivors' testimonies, smuggled out through émigré communities, describe being intercepted not by German raiders, but by Soviet naval patrols. Crews were disarmed, cargo confiscated, and those who resisted were transported to holding facilities near Arkhangelsk. For some, the trail ends in the Gulag, where merchant sailors simply vanished from history, their names struck from naval lists as though they had never existed. There are whispers of collusion. At the height of the war, Britain and the United States had no appetite for conflict with their uneasy Soviet ally. If Moscow demanded the diversion of critical supplies under secrecy, London may have complied, preferring silence to diplomatic rupture. One heavily redacted SOE memorandum, declassified in the early 2000s, references logistical assets surrendered under controlled disappearance. The phrase is cold, bureaucratic, and devastating. It suggests DN-12 was sacrificed, its men condemned to silence so that governments could maintain the illusion of unbroken cooperation. The human toll was profound. The families of sailors never received clarity. Official death certificates listed presumed drowned, though no wreckage was ever recovered. No bodies washed ashore. Their widows lived with unanswered questions, their children raised on half-truths. When inquiries were raised in Parliament, after the war, officials deflected, citing the chaos of Arctic operations. The truth that their loved ones may have been deliberately erased was too dangerous to admit. The story of DN-12 gained new dimension with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Researchers combing through neglected archives in Moscow uncovered references to a convoy redirected in entirety in late 1943, noted in NKVD correspondence with the Soviet Navy. Among the seized cargo was mention of Western radar components, secured under directive from Commissar Malenkov. If true, it means Britain and America lost cutting-edge technology not to their enemies, but to their supposed ally. That knowledge, could explain why the record of DN-12 was so carefully destroyed, why Admiralty logs were purged, and why survivors who spoke out disappeared into Soviet prisons. Consider the atmosphere of those Arctic runs, the shriek of Stuka dive bombers, the relentless crash of waves against steel hulls, the constant threat of icebergs. Now imagine a different terror, the sudden appearance of Soviet destroyers under red banners demanding surrender. Men who believed they were risking their lives to supply an ally found themselves prisoners of the same ally, their cargo stripped under threat of execution. The betrayal would have been as cold as the seas that surrounded them. It was not an enemy they feared, but a partner they could not trust. The silence surrounding DN-12 has endured for decades. No memorial lists its name. No official history acknowledges its existence. Even naval historians specializing in the Arctic convoys are often unaware of its designation. So thoroughly has it been erased. Yet in the margins of declassified files and the whispered testimonies of survivors' families, the truth persists. A convoy vanished not because of German attacks, but because its disappearance served political necessity. The Allied war effort, so often framed as a story of unity and sacrifice, concealed moments of profound betrayal, where expedience outweighed justice, and silence was more valuable than truth. To this day, the fate of DN-12 is unresolved. Were the sailors executed, absorbed into Soviet labor camps, or quietly released under new identities? No one can say. What remains is the chilling certainty that their story was never meant to be told. Their disappearance was not an accident, but a decision. A decision buried under the ice of history, frozen in secrecy, and erased from the memory of nations that preferred to hide the cracks in their alliance. The vanished convoy of Murmansk is a ghost ship in the archives, a reminder that even in the fight against tyranny, truth itself can be drowned in silence. Chapter 4: Operation Paperclip's Forbidden Predecessor. The world knows Operation Paperclip as the controversial American project that smuggled Nazi scientists into the United States after the war, offering immunity in exchange for their expertise in rocketry, aviation, and weapons technology. Yet hidden beneath that already uneasy history lies an even darker precedent. An earlier program conceived in 1944, before the war had even ended, codenamed Project Luster. Its existence was denied for decades, its files scattered or destroyed, its scientists absorbed into post-war laboratories under new identities. Only fragments of declassified OSS memoranda, uncovered in the 1970s, reveal its contours. A desperate, forbidden mission to secure Germany's chemical warfare experts, even as the Holocaust continued, even as their crimes mounted. The program did not wait for surrender. It did not wait for trials. It began while the smoke of the crematoria still rose over occupied Europe. The origins of Project Luster lie in the growing terror of chemical weapons. Since the First World War, the spectre of poison gas haunted military planners. By 1943, Allied intelligence had learned of German nerve agents, particularly tabun, a compound so lethal that a single drop on the skin could kill within minutes. Unlike chlorine or mustard gas, tabun was odorless, invisible, and devastating. Reports suggested mass stockpiles hidden in secret facilities across Germany, guarded by the Wehrmacht's Chemical Warfare Division. To the Allies, the prospect of such weapons falling into Soviet hands was intolerable. Thus, in the winter of the 1944, under the cloak of secrecy, British and American agencies launched a race to seize the scientists who created them. Justice was not the goal, control was. Field units attached to the OSS and Britain's Special Operations Executive began tracking individuals tied to the program. Among them were Dr. Otto Ambros, an IG Farben executive who oversaw synthetic fuel and chemical weapons production, and Dr. Gerhard Schrader, the chemist who had first synthesized tabun in 1936. These men had overseen experiments that tested nerve agents on prisoners in camps such as Die Herrenfurth, where inmates were forced to handle chemicals under lethal conditions. Testimonies from Nuremberg later described prisoners collapsing in agony, their lungs seizing, their bodies convulsing until death brought release. Yet instead of preparing indictments, Allied operatives prepared extraction plans. The mechanism was chillingly efficient. Under Project Luster, select scientists were given new identities, their SS affiliations erased through forged Red Cross documents. Safe houses in Switzerland, Spain, and even Sweden served as waypoints. From there, they were quietly funneled into Britain and the United States. In exchange, they provided intelligence on German stockpiles, formulas for nerve agents, and designs for delivery systems. By spring 1945, months before Germany's surrender, several had already been installed in Allied research laboratories. In one case, an entire family was relocated under the guise of displaced persons. Their neighbors in Germany believed they had perished in the chaos of war. In reality, they were living under protection, their knowledge more valuable than the lives they had destroyed. The files that survive make clear the moral compromise. One OSS memo, marked Eyes Only, notes, "Subjects may possess criminal pasts, such factors secondary to strategic necessity." Another, dated January 1945, warns, "Ensure no documentation survives that ties individuals to experiments." It was not oversight, it was deliberate erasure. Crimes against humanity were buried beneath scientific potential. Even among intelligence officers, whispers of unease spread. A British SOE agent reportedly wrote, "We have bartered with monsters, and in so doing, become complicit." His report was suppressed. His career ended abruptly. What makes Project Luster especially disturbing is its continuity. When Operation Paperclip was officially launched after the war, many of its earliest recruits had already been secured through this clandestine pipeline. Their files were laundered, their pasts sanitized. At Nuremberg, prosecutors presented evidence of chemical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. But several key figures never appeared in the dock. They had vanished, protected by the very nations that claimed to demand justice. To the public, they were simply unaccounted for. To insiders, they were assets, relocated under new names, building careers in laboratories far from the ruins of Europe. Consider the cruel irony. Survivors of chemical weapons testing at Nazi camps were silenced, their testimony suppressed, while the perpetrators were sheltered and rewarded. In some cases, the same compounds tested on prisoners were refined in Allied laboratories within a year of the war's end. Scientists who should have stood trial instead dined in comfort, their expertise rebranded as vital to national security. Their victims remained nameless, their suffering erased in official histories. In declassified CIA notes from the 1950s, one scientist once tied to Project Luster appears under a new designation, working on Cold War nerve agent countermeasures. His Nazi affiliations are described only as unverified rumor. The erasure was near total. To picture the reality of Project Luster, imagine a train pulling quietly out of a bombed German city in late 1944. On board sits a man who once signed orders consigning camp prisoners to lethal experiments. He carries no SS insignia now, only a forged passport stamped with neutral papers. Outside, civilians starve and freeze, entire towns reduced to rubble. Inside, he is guarded, protected, even valued. The Allies, who only months earlier had condemned his crimes, now shelter him. His silence is purchased, his knowledge extracted, his past erased. He is not a fugitive. He is an asset. The forbidden predecessor to Paperclip exposes a truth most governments would prefer remain hidden. The Allies' hands were not clean. In the name of victory, in the pursuit of power, they chose complicity over justice. They chose to erase crimes rather than confront them. Project Luster's legacy is not written in textbooks, nor memorialized in museums. It lingers in the shadows of classified archives, in redacted lines of intelligence files, in the missing names from Nuremberg's defendant lists. It is a reminder that history is not only shaped by what is remembered, but by what is deliberately forgotten. And some erasures, like the forbidden origins of Paperclip, are too dark ever to be fully revealed. The stories we have reopened tonight carry with them a chilling weight. They are not tales of valor or triumph, but of silence, erasure, and betrayal. In Nemmersdorf, a massacre was buried beneath layers of propaganda, its survivors silenced so that alliances could endure. In Moscow, the fate of Poland was signed away with a single tick of Stalin's blue pencil, while those who fought for freedom were condemned to decades of oppression. In the frozen Arctic, an entire convoy was erased, its men and cargo consumed by secrecy, leaving only the faintest trace in declassified notes. And in the shadows of intelligence services, the architects of chemical warfare were smuggled to safety, their crimes buried, their knowledge purchased, their victims forgotten. These were not isolated incidents. They were deliberate choices made by governments who understood the power of silence, the value of erasure, and the cost of truth. As we close these files, one question remains. How many more stories, equally disturbing, lie hidden in the archives, sealed under redactions, waiting for the day when silence is no longer enough? The war may have ended in 1945, but its forbidden shadows are still with us, waiting in the dark.